in the early years of World War II, when uncertainty gripped the globe and nations were desperate for an edge against the rising tide of fascism, a bold experiment was born. The 1st Special Service Force, an extraordinary joint unit of American and Canadian soldiers, came together in 1942 with one purpose: to undertake missions so dangerous that few others dared to try. Initially designed to strike at German heavy water facilities in Norway, a critical part of Hitler's atomic ambitions, this group of volunteers was destined to become far more than just a project on paper. They would evolve into one of the most fearsome and respected fighting units of the entire war. From the very beginning, this unit was unique. Unlike traditional divisions, the force was made up of men who signed up for something mysterious, a mission they could not even be told about at the time. Young soldiers, barely out of their teenage years, chose to step forward, willing to risk everything without knowing what awaited them. That choice alone revealed the kind of spirit that would define the Black Devils, as they would later be called by their enemies. It was not just about bravery, it was about commitment, sacrifice, and the belief that freedom was worth fighting for, even in the most perilous circumstances. Imagine the scene: recruits arriving at remote training camps in the mountains of Montana and Canada. They were far from home, far from family, and far from the comforts of everyday life. Instead, they faced grueling marches, parachute jumps, and punishing drills designed to break the weak and harden the strong. Out of this fire of preparation, a brotherhood was forged. Americans and Canadians worked, sweated, and endured side by side until their differences melted away. They were no longer separated by borders, they were united as one force with one mission. But what truly set them apart was not just the training, nor the missions they would later complete. It was the identity they carried, their faces blackened for night raids, their silent movements through enemy lines, their reputation for striking suddenly and disappearing like ghosts. These qualities gave birth to the chilling nickname whispered by German soldiers, the Black Devils. It was a name that struck fear into the enemy, but it also became a badge of honor for the men who had earned it. This story is not just about war, it is about courage, sacrifice, and legacy. It is about young men who chose to fight for something bigger than themselves and left behind lessons that still matter today. In this video, we will journey through their creation, their battles, and the incredible impact they made on the world. We will uncover not only the history but also the human stories that remind us why their legacy endures. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, then please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who value history and courage. Your support ensures that the memory of the Black Devils and the sacrifices they made will continue to inspire generations to come. When the 1st Special Service Force finally stepped onto the battlefield, everything they had endured during those long months of punishing preparation was put to the test. These men were not ordinary soldiers thrown together by chance. They were forged through exhaustion, sharpened by discipline, and bonded by a sense of loyalty that crossed national lines. When the order came to move against the enemy, they carried not only their weapons, but also the weight of expectations from two nations that had entrusted them with impossible tasks. And it was in those moments, under the cover of darkness, that they revealed the full measure of who they were. The enemy would come to know them not by the flags on their shoulders, but by the shadows that haunted the night, slipping through the darkness with their faces blackened by camouflage. They moved like whispers across the terrain. There was no warning before the strike, no sound before the crash of sudden violence, and no chance for the enemy to gather themselves before the Black Devils disappeared once more into the night. To the German soldiers who faced them, it was as if an unseen predator hunted relentlessly, appearing without pattern or mercy. Fear spread quickly, not because of numbers but because of reputation. And that reputation was carved into the minds of the enemy through every silent raid, every ruthless ambush, every body left behind with a calling card that reminded them the Black Devils had been there. The nickname was not chosen by the men themselves. It was given by those who feared them most. To be called the Black Devils was not an insult, but a confirmation of the impact they were making on the battlefield. For the men who wore the name, it became a reminder of their strength, of the bond that held them together in the face of impossible odds. But behind the chilling label and the whispered fear, there were human beings' sons, husbands, brothers who carried the burden of war each time they vanished into the dark and returned hours later, their faces streaked with grime, their eyes reflecting the weight of what they had done. The raids at Anzio, in particular, etched their legend into history. Trapped on a precarious beachhead, where days stretched into weeks of unrelenting danger, the force refused to be broken by the stalemate. Instead of waiting passively behind defensive lines, they turned the night into their domain. Each evening, small groups would crawl into enemy territory, slipping silently past sentries, striking swiftly at command posts, supply depots, and gun positions before vanishing into the void once more. The psychological toll of these missions was devastating for the Germans, who never knew when or where the next attack would come. Every shadow seemed to carry a threat. Every sound in the dark became a warning. In the letters and diaries left behind, enemy soldiers admitted the terror that crept into their camps. And it was from those accounts that the infamous name Black Devils was born. For the force, the nickname carried a dual meaning. On the battlefield, it was a weapon in itself, a way of undermining the enemy's confidence before a shot was even fired. Yet within the ranks, it became a rallying point, a sign that their efforts were recognized even if only through fear. The men learned to embrace it, not with arrogance but with the quiet pride of soldiers who knew they were making a difference. They were not the largest unit, nor the most heavily armed, but they were relentless, and that relentlessness made them legendary. Still, behind every story of daring raids and whispered terror lies a deeper reality often forgotten. These men lived with exhaustion as a constant companion, their bodies battered by endless combat and sleepless nights, their minds strained by the weight of loss. The Black Devil's reputation was earned through sacrifice, and that sacrifice often came at a high cost. Comrades fell in the darkness, friendships were torn apart by sudden violence, and the survivors carried scars that would never fade. Yet they pressed on, not because they loved the fight, but because they believed the fight mattered. Each mission completed, each enemy position destroyed, brought them closer to the hope of ending a war that had consumed the world. As their legend grew, so too did the myths that surrounded them. Some enemy soldiers whispered that the Black Devils were not men at all but creatures of the night, invisible until it was too late. Others claimed they could melt into the earth itself, vanishing before the eye could catch them. These exaggerations, born from fear, only strengthened the force power. But to the men who lived it, the truth was far simpler. They were ordinary individuals asked to do extraordinary things, and in the face of relentless pressure, they rose to the challenge again and again. The story of their blackened faces and the name that came with it is more than a tale of clever tactics or psychological warfare. It is a story of identity, of how a group of volunteers from two different nations came together to form a brotherhood so unbreakable that even their enemies gave them a single name. That name, whispered in fear on the battlefield, has echoed through history as a symbol of what courage, unity, and determination can achieve when tested in the harshest crucible imaginable. The Black Devils were not just shadows in the night, they were a force that shaped the outcome of battles, lifted the spirits of allies, and carved their place into the enduring memory of a world at war. Before the Black Devils ever set foot on the battlefields that would make their name echo through history, They first had to survive an ordeal that tested every fiber of their strength and willpower. The men who answered the mysterious call for volunteers had little idea of what awaited them, only that they would be part of something secret, something dangerous, and perhaps something greater than themselves. What followed was not just training in the traditional sense, but an unrelenting crucible designed to push them beyond the limits of ordinary soldiers, shaping them into a brotherhood of warriors who could endure the impossible and strike fear into the enemy. The training grounds chosen for this experiment were not easy places to live or fight. Isolated in the rugged wilderness of Montana, the recruits found themselves in a landscape that was both breathtaking and brutal. Mountains rose sharply against the sky. Forests stretched endlessly into the distance, and the cold bit at their skin long before the first drops of sweat began to form. Each morning, long before the sun had fully risen, the men were ordered into punishing marches that wound through steep terrain, testing their endurance as they carried heavy packs and weapons. The marches were not meant simply to build muscle or stamina, they were designed to strip away weakness, to expose who could endure and who would falter when pushed beyond comfort. Step by step, by mile, the men learned what it meant to dig deeper than they ever had before. Beyond the endless miles of marching, the training introduced them to the skies. Many had never been near an aircraft before, yet now they were expected to leap from planes in the uncertain air, trusting silk parachutes to deliver them safely to the ground. Fear was natural in those moments, but fear was also a teacher, and those who overcame it found themselves standing taller, more confident, more ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Each jump built trust not only in their equipment but in each other. For every man knew that his survival depended on the discipline and focus of those who trained beside him. The bond between American and Canadian recruits began to deepen, no longer defined by nationality, but by the shared experience of standing on the edge of the unknown and taking that leap together. Mountain warfare added yet another layer to their transformation, scaling cliffs in the biting wind, clinging to ropes as the world dropped away beneath them. They discovered skills that would one day allow them to outmaneuver enemies on the most unforgiving battlefields. The mountains demanded patience, focus, and teamwork, for one slip could mean disaster not only for the climber but for everyone roped together on the ascent. These drills were not merely about learning how to fight in rugged terrain. They were about learning how to trust one another with their lives. In those moments, the distinction between American and Canadian dissolved completely. They became one force, bound by the knowledge that survival in the harshest environments required unity, discipline, and an unbreakable spirit. As weeks turned into months, the men grew leaner, harder, and more resilient. Their hands were calloused, their muscles etched, and exhaustion became as familiar as breathing. But with each challenge, they discovered a new layer of strength. The instructors, relentless in their demands, understood that the enemy they would face would not give second chances. To falter in training was to risk death in battle, and so the standards were unforgiving. But within that harshness lay a hidden gift, the realization that they were capable of more than they had ever imagined. The recruits who had once been strangers from different towns, provinces, and states now stood shoulder to shoulder, indistinguishable from one another in their determination. The hardships they endured forged something far greater than skill alone. They built a unity that transcended borders, a brotherhood that would carry them through the horrors of combat and beyond. Around campfires after long days of training, stories were shared, jokes exchanged, and friendships formed that would last lifetimes. In those quiet moments, when laughter rose into the cold night air, they began to understand that they were no longer simply American soldiers or Canadian soldiers. They were members of something unique, something that would soon be tested in the crucible of war. This unity, born from exhaustion and shared struggle, would prove vital when the force finally entered combat. The ability to trust the man beside you without hesitation, to know that he had endured the same pain, the same fear, and had refused to break this was what set the 1st Special Service Force apart. Their training was not about producing individuals. It was about producing a collective, a living organism that could think, move, and fight as one. And when they finally faced the enemy, this unity would become their greatest weapon, allowing them to achieve victories that seemed impossible and to earn a reputation that would outlive the war itself. The story of their training is often overshadowed by the battles that followed. But without it, there would have been no Black Devils, no whispered name that struck terror into the hearts of their foes. The long marches, the leaps into empty air, the climbs into unforgiving mountains, all of it was essential to the creation of a force unlike any other. What began as an experiment in cooperation between two nations became, through sweat, grit, and endurance, one of the most formidable special units the world had ever seen. The men who survived that training did not simply learn how to fight. They learned how to rely on one another, how to push beyond fear, and how to transform hardship into strength. And it was this transformation that prepared them for the darkness ahead, where their blackened faces would emerge from the night to etch their legend into the annals of history. The moment of truth for the men of the 1st Special Service Force came on the steep slopes of Monti della Defensa, a seemingly unshakable German stronghold in the rugged mountains of Italy. After months of training that had demanded every ounce of strength from their bodies and unity from their spirits, the time had come to prove whether the sacrifice had been worth it. The force had been forged in the cold winds of Montana and the relentless discipline of mountain warfare drills, but now the test would be in blood, in exhaustion, and in the face of an enemy who believed the position was untouchable. To reach the summit of that mountain meant climbing not only against nature, but against an entrenched and determined foe who had every advantage of height. Fortification and preparation. The mountain itself was a formidable opponent. Jagged ridges cut into the sky, and the trails that wound toward the summit were slick with snow and mud. Rain turned the ground into treacherous slopes, while fog clung to the ridges like a living thing, obscuring vision and muffling sound. For the men ascending under these conditions, every step became a battle in itself, their boots sinking into the earth, their breath clouding in the frozen air, their bodies straining beneath heavy packs and weapons. Yet there was no choice but to push forward. The Germans had occupied the summit with the expectation that no one could possibly climb it under such conditions, and that arrogance would become the very crack the force needed to exploit. The attack began under the cover of darkness, just as so many of their training exercises had. Moving silently, their faces smeared with the same black camouflage that would one day make their name feared. They climbed in near silence, gripping ropes, holding themselves up sheer slopes, and dragging their equipment behind them. The conditions were merciless. The freezing rain seeped into clothing, turning every movement into a test of will, while the fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. And yet, strangely, this same fog that hindered them also became their ally, cloaking their advance and hiding their presence from the sentries above. What the Germans could not see, they could not stop, and the force used that gift of nature to close the distance unnoticed. When they finally broke from the cover of the mountain's side and launched their assault, the battle erupted with sudden fury. Grenades exploded in flashes of fire against the fog, rifles cracked in the darkness, and shouts pierced the night as the defenders realized too late that their sanctuary was under attack. The force fought with the precision of men who had rehearsed hardship endlessly, their movements disciplined even in the chaos. The climb had left them exhausted, but it had also left them hardened. And now that endurance carried them forward. Inch by inch, bunker by bunker, they pressed higher, seizing positions that had seemed unassailable. The fighting was close, brutal, and unrelenting. Visibility was almost non-existent, and the men often found themselves face to face with defenders in the murk, forced to rely on instinct and training to survive. The mud clung to their boots, the cold gnawed at their fingers, and the exhaustion of the climb weighed on every muscle. But still they advanced. For every man who stumbled, another pulled him forward. For every moment when doubt threatened to overwhelm, the memory of their shared hardships reminded them that they had not come this far to fail. Slowly, relentlessly, the force drove the Germans from their fortified positions, pushing them back across the summit until at last the mountain, once deemed impregnable, was theirs. The victory at Monti della Defensa was more than just a tactical success. It was a moment that validated everything the force had endured, a living proof that their unorthodox training, their unity as Americans and Canadians bound together, and their willingness to face the impossible had all been worth it. News of the battle spread quickly, not only among allies who drew inspiration from the daring assault, but also among enemies who began to realize that a new kind of soldier had entered the war. The Germans had believed the mountain was untouchable, and yet in a single night, the Black Devils had taken it from them, leaving behind a message that nowhere was truly safe. For the men themselves, the memory of that battle would remain etched forever. They remembered the sound of boots scraping against rock, the sting of icy rain on their faces, the deafening thunder of gunfire rolling through the fog, and the faces of friends who did not return from the summit. The price of victory had been steep, as it always was, but the accomplishment bound them even more tightly together. They had climbed through exhaustion and fought through the elements, and they had stood victorious at the top of a mountain the enemy had sworn could not be taken. That night on Monti della Defensa became a turning point, not only in their journey as a unit, but in their identity as the Black Devils. It was there that the legends whispered by their enemies began to take shape. There that the fear of an invisible, relentless force spread through German ranks. And there that the men themselves realized what they were capable of achieving together. The mountain had been more than just a battlefield. It had been a proving ground, and they had emerged from it as something far greater than volunteers who had once signed up for a mission they knew nothing about. They had become the embodiment of unity, endurance, and fearlessness. And the world would soon learn to recognize their name. From that first great victory, the path ahead remained filled with dangers, but the lesson of Monti della Defensa carried them forward. If they could take a mountain in the dead of night, in snow, rain, and fog, against an enemy who believed it was impossible, then there was no challenge they could not meet. And as they marched on to the battles that awaited them, the legend of the Black Devils began to grow, not in the stories they told themselves, but in the whispers of the enemies who dreaded the night for fear of who might be moving silently through the shadows. The struggle that awaited the men after their hard-won triumph on Monti della Defensa would test them in ways even harsher than the mountains had. For the beaches and fields of Anzio would demand not just endurance, but a kind of unbroken resilience that few soldiers in history ever been forced to summon. The 1st Special Service Force was thrust into one of the most punishing campaigns of the war, and what followed was 99 days of relentless pressure. A crucible of fire and fatigue that transformed their reputation from whispers in the night into legend carved across the battlefields of Italy. The landing itself was only the beginning, a moment of chaos and uncertainty where every man knew that once his boots touched the sand, there would be no retreat. Only the long ordeal of holding ground against an enemy determined to drive them back into the sea. The men dug themselves into the earth, living in shallow holes that served as both shelter and prison. the ground wet and cold beneath them, the skies above alive with the scream of artillery shells. Sleep was a luxury rarely granted, and meals were swallowed quickly, if at, between incoming fire and sudden orders. The lines were thin, stretched across the beachhead in desperate defiance of German forces that pressed hard from every direction. In such a place, survival depended not only on weapons and tactics but on the unyielding strength of spirit. And it was here that the force proved once more that their unity and conditioning made them something altogether different from ordinary troops. By day they endured the constant barrage, but it was at night that they revealed what set them apart. For when darkness fell, the black devils became hunters, moving with silent precision. Their faces blackened until they seemed to vanish into the shadows. They crossed the no-man's land between the lines and slipped deep into enemy positions. These raids were swift, merciless in their execution, and devastating to German morale. Men vanished in the night. Strong points were dismantled, supply lines disrupted, and the enemy never knew from where the next blow might come. The terror of those raids spread quickly through German ranks. Stories whispered of shadowy figures who struck without warning and disappeared before a counterattack could be mounted. It was not only the skill of the force that made these operations so effective, but the aura of dread they cultivated, the psychological warfare that made opponents fear the very darkness around them. For the men of the force, the raids were as grueling as they were effective. Every mission carried the weight of risk, each step through the night a gamble with death, each silence broken by the faintest sound a reminder that discovery meant disaster. They carried their weapons, grenades, and knives, relying on stealth as much as strength. And every time they returned from the darkness, it was with the knowledge that they had survived another night that could have easily been their last. Yet the danger only seemed to bind them closer, each raid reinforcing their faith in one another, each success proving that their training and courage could defy the odds again and again. 99 days is a span that sounds simple when spoken, but for the men who lived it, every hour stretched into eternity. The mud, the hunger, the fatigue, and the constant proximity of death wore down the body and tested the mind. And still, they endured. Their commanders relied on them for tasks others could not accomplish, knowing that when the situation demanded the impossible, the force would find a way. The casualty lists grew longer. The faces of friends were replaced with the silence of loss. Yet the survivors pressed on, driven by the conviction that retreat was unthinkable, and that their sacrifice was a price to be paid for the greater cause they had pledged themselves to. When the time finally came for the breakout, it was the force at the front, leading the charge against fortified positions that had stalled the advance for weeks. Through villages, across fields, and over bridges guarded by machine guns and heavy artillery, they moved with the ferocity of men determined to finish what had begun on that cold night at Monti della Defensa. Every yard gained was paid for with sweat and blood, but slowly the German lines cracked beneath the pressure, and the road to Rome opened before them. The men who had once been considered experimental, an untested joint unit of Canadians and Americans, had now proven themselves as one of the most effective and feared forces in the entire theatre. The people of Italy, who had suffered under occupation and watched their homes become battlegrounds, greeted the advancing soldiers with gratitude that words could scarcely capture. Wine appeared from hidden cellars, flags unfurled from windows, and families opened their doors to men who looked as though they had walked straight out of the smoke and ash of legend. For the force, the reception was both a relief and a reminder of why they fought, a glimpse of humanity and joy amid months of unrelenting hardship. Yet even in the celebration, the shadows of what they had endured lingered, for the memory of those 99 days could not be washed away by cheers or applause. The legacy of Anzio was written not only in victory but in the character it revealed. The Black Devils had endured a test of endurance few could imagine, surviving on willpower as much as rations, fighting with cunning as much as firepower, and proving that the line between survival and despair could be crossed only by those who refused to surrender to either. Their reputation, already whispered after Italy's mountains, became solidified on the beaches of Anzio, where German soldiers left diaries describing their fear of the dark, their dread of the unseen enemy who came with painted faces and vanished before dawn. From the grueling mud of Anzio to the triumphant entry into Rome, the 1st Special Service Force carried with them not just the weight of their own sacrifices, but the knowledge that their name now inspired both pride among their allies and fear among their enemies. They had become more than soldiers. They were symbols of unbreakable resolve, living proof that even in the harshest conditions, unity, courage, and determination could turn the tide. And though many of them would never leave those beaches, their brothers carried their memory forward, ensuring that the story of those 99 days would never be forgotten. For it was in that crucible that the Black Devils earned their immortality. The story of the 1st Special Service Force cannot be told without confronting the staggering toll it took on the men who wore its insignia. By the time their campaigns stretched from the icy mountains of Italy to the contested beaches and villages of Europe, the unit had endured a casualty rate of 134%. To those unfamiliar with the mathematics of war, such a figure might seem impossible, but it reflects a truth that defined the Black Devils. Not only were nearly all of them killed, wounded, or captured at some point in their service, but many of those who were injured refused to remain in hospitals and instead returned to the line, bearing scars, stitches, and broken bones as proof of their unwillingness to abandon their comrades. Their determination was not born out of recklessness, but out of a fierce loyalty to one another and an unshakable belief that the fight could not be left to anyone else. The reality of war meant that every day the force faced the possibility of seeing friends fall beside them. In the mountains, they watched men slip into the abyss or collapse from exhaustion only steps from the summit. At Anzio, the bombardments churned the very earth beneath them, and shells claimed foxholes indiscriminately. In such a world, bonds were forged not in idle words, but in the certainty that one man's survival depended entirely on the strength of the one next to him. When a soldier was carried to the rear, many could not bear the thought of remaining behind while their brothers advanced into the unknown without them. For some, a wound was not a reprieve, but a reminder that they were missing from where they were most needed. Stories circulated of men who left hospital beds still bandaged, who insisted on rejoining their unit before doctors declared them fit. Others concealed the severity of their injuries, tightening belts around wounded limbs or ignoring the pain in order to continue climbing, marching, or fighting. To them, the prospect of being absent while their unit bore the brunt of battle was unthinkable. They had trained together in the snows of Montana, shared the same miserable rations, endured the same endless marches, and faced the same uphill battles under fire. To leave the line was to betray that shared sacrifice, and so many chose instead to return, even at the risk of their own lives. Such devotion gave the unit a character unlike any other. In most formations, high casualty rates meant a gradual erosion of effectiveness, a slow weakening of morale as losses mounted. But in the case of the force, the very act of returning wounded men to the front reinforced the sense of invincibility. Each time a comrade reappeared, scared but unbroken, it sent a message to both friend and foe. Nothing could truly remove the Black Devils from the fight. This defiance became part of their legend, contributing to the aura of fear that spread among German soldiers who wrote in diaries of facing opponents who seemed unwilling to die. Men who appeared again and again no matter how many times they had been struck down. Yet the cost of such devotion was immense. Behind every statistic was a life reshaped forever. Some carried shrapnel in their bodies for the rest of their days. Others lived with the permanent ache of old fractures. And many bore the invisible weight of memories that could not be erased. The casualty rate was not just a number. It was a measure of the price they paid for every foothold gained, every ridge taken, every village liberated. The scars were not only physical but emotional, borne in silence long after the battles ended, carried home to families who could never fully comprehend what had been endured. In Italy, when the force seized positions that had been deemed unassailable, it was often men still healing from earlier wounds who fought at the front. In Anzio, when the night stretched endlessly under bombardment, it was men who had already been stitched together once before who painted their faces black and slipped into the shadows for raids. Their courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it again and again, even after knowing firsthand the pain it could bring. Such resolve inspired those around them and reinforced the unity that was the lifeblood of the force. Commanders recognized the extraordinary sacrifice, but often struggled with the consequences. A soldier who returned too soon risked reopening wounds, collapsing mid-march, or being lost entirely in the next fight. And yet, many leaders knew better than to deny a man the right to stand beside his brothers. For to strip him of that choice was to take away the very bond that gave the force its unmatched cohesion. The high casualty rate became a reflection not of weakness but of strength, a paradox that defined the unit from its creation to its disbandment. The legend of the Black Devils was written not only in their victories but in their willingness to endure what should have broken them. That willingness was embodied most powerfully in their refusal to leave the battlefield even when wounded, in their insistence on returning again and again until their bodies could no longer carry them. Their enemies came to dread the night raids, but perhaps what terrified them even more was the realization that these men seemed never to diminish, that for every wound inflicted, another devil appeared in the shadows, relentless and undeterred. When historians later reflected on the force, the casualty rate stood out as one of the most striking details. But within that grim number lay the essence of who they were. Men who believed that their duty was not finished until the mission was complete, who saw pain as temporary but loyalty as eternal, and who chose to return to the storm rather than rest in safety. Their sacrifice was not measured in numbers alone, but in the endurance of a spirit that could not be extinguished. A spirit that made the Black Devils more than soldiers. They became a symbol of what human determination can achieve when bound by loyalty, unity, and the unshakable belief that some causes are worth every cost. At the heart of the 1st Special Service Force stood a leader whose presence was felt not from behind a desk or through distant orders, but in the mud, the snow, and the fire alongside his men. General Robert Frederick was not the kind of commander who relied solely on strategy and rank to inspire obedience. Instead, he chose to lead from the very front, sharing in the same dangers and hardships as those he commanded, and in doing so, he forged a bond with his soldiers that was far deeper than mere military discipline. For men who had already been pushed beyond their limits in training and battle, Frederick's example became the unifying thread that tied them together, transcending differences of nationality and background, shaping them into one inseparable brotherhood. From the earliest days of the unit's formation, Frederick's leadership style stood out. He was not much older than many of his men, and his appearance was unassuming. But what set him apart was his unwavering willingness to shoulder the same burdens as those he led. During grueling mountain marches, he climbed the same slopes and endured the same exhaustion. When parachute jumps tested nerves, he was in the aircraft too, prepared to leap into the uncertain skies. His presence transformed the atmosphere of the force, for his men knew he would never ask them to do anything he would not do himself. This sense of fairness and shared risk became a foundation of trust that held firm even when the storms of war grew most violent. In battle, Frederick's leadership took on an almost magnetic quality. He did not direct operations from safe distances, but placed himself where the fighting was thickest, where decisions had to be made in the blink of an eye, and where the outcome of the mission often hung in the balance. At Monti della Defensa, as the men fought uphill in bitter weather against entrenched defenses, Frederick was there with them, climbing, shouting encouragement, and making clear that he was part of the struggle. At Anzio, when night raids became the lifeblood of survival, he oversaw the operations with a calm determination, instilling confidence that carried his men through the long nights of fear and fatigue. For soldiers who faced the constant possibility of death, the knowledge that their general was standing in the mud beside them gave strength that no orders alone could provide. What made Frederick's leadership even more remarkable was the way it dissolved barriers that might otherwise have divided the force. Americans and Canadians entered the unit with different traditions, accents, and habits, and while training had forged unity through shared hardship, it was Frederick who nurtured that unity into something indestructible. He treated them not as two nations forced into cooperation, but as one family bound by purpose. Around him, the distinctions between north and south of the border seemed irrelevant. What mattered was their shared commitment to each other and to the mission. Under his command, camaraderie grew not as a matter of chance, but as a deliberate cultivation of loyalty and respect. That camaraderie was not limited to moments of victory. When casualties mounted and the toll of battle pressed heavily upon them, Frederick shared in their grief, often writing to families, often visiting the wounded, and never allowing the weight of command to distance him from the humanity of his men. They respected him not only because he was brave in the field, but because he cared deeply for their lives. Many later remembered that his presence was not just that of a general, but of a leader who felt more like a comrade. Someone who understood the depth of their sacrifices and carried those sacrifices with him. Stories spread among the force about Frederick's willingness to risk himself for the sake of his soldiers. There were times when he personally scouted dangerous ground, times when he refused to retreat even under heavy fire, and times when his voice cut through the chaos to steady nerves and restore order. In those moments, his men learned what true leadership meant. It was not the insignia on his shoulders, but the courage in his actions that made him the figure they would follow into any storm. For them, his name became a symbol of reliability, proof that no matter how dire the situation, they were never abandoned. As the force's reputation grew and their enemies came to fear the Black Devils, the bond between Frederick and his men only deepened. Their trust in him mirrored their trust in one another, and this cycle of loyalty became the invisible armor that allowed them to endure battles that broke other units. It was not uncommon for soldiers to say they would go anywhere Frederick asked them to, no matter how dangerous, because they knew he would be there too, facing the same danger, carrying the same burden. When the war moved on and the force continued its campaign across Italy and beyond, the camaraderie within the unit became its most defining trait. Around campfires and in foxholes, Canadians and Americans laughed together, mourned together, and planned for battles together, no longer thinking in terms of separate identities, but as brothers bound by blood and struggle. Frederick, with his steady hand and an unshakable presence, had given them the model by which to live and fight, and they embraced it fully. The casualty rates were high, the missions relentless, and the hardships unending, but within the force there was a resilience that astonished allies and terrified enemies. That resilience was not born of sheer toughness alone, but of a camaraderie that was so deeply rooted it could not be broken. Frederick had not created that bond single-handedly. War itself played its part, but his leadership gave it focus, strength, and permanence. By the end of their service, when the 1st Special Service Force was finally disbanded, Many of the men looked back on their time under Frederick not simply as soldiers serving a general, but as brothers guided by one of their own. His leadership left an imprint that extended far beyond the war, a reminder that the greatest commanders are those who walk beside their men, who lead not through distance but through presence, and who transform a collection of individuals into a family. For the Black Devils, that family was their greatest strength, and General Robert Frederick was its unshakable foundation. Even as the 1st Special Service Force was molded in the crucible of training and hardened by the unforgiving demands of battle, there existed another side to their story, one that unfolded not on the frozen ridges of Italy or in the smoke-filled nights of Anzio, but in the brief moments of humanity that bloomed in the shadows of war. Despite the strict rules that governed their daily lives, many of these young men, caught between the uncertainty of tomorrow and the intensity of the present, found themselves drawn into romances that defied the regulations of military order. Out of these forbidden loves emerged over 200 marriages, binding the lives of soldiers and civilians in vows that carried both hope and dread, and giving rise to what history would remember as the war brides. The backdrop of such unions was far from idyllic. Training bases were strict, and every hour seemed consumed by relentless marches, parachute jumps, or mountain climbs. Yet within that world of fatigue and discipline, soldiers sometimes crossed paths with women from nearby towns or cities, and from those fleeting encounters, attachments grew quickly. Perhaps it was the knowledge that each day could be their last that made love burn with such urgency. For many, the thought of facing the dangers ahead without first claiming some measure of joy felt unbearable. Love, in those circumstances, was not a luxury but a necessity, a fragile shield against the crushing weight of uncertainty. Commanders frowned upon such relationships, viewing them as distractions from the singular focus of training and preparation for war. But rules have little power over the human heart, and in barracks and small chapels, in towns near the training grounds, vows were exchanged. These weddings, often simple and hurried, were not grand affairs marked by long planning and elaborate celebrations. Instead, they carried a raw sincerity, a determination to cling to happiness in the face of looming peril. For the soldiers, marriage offered not only love but also a tether to life beyond the battlefield, a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. For the women who became war brides, the decision was equally profound. They knew they were marrying men whose futures were uncertain, men who could be called away at any moment to confront unimaginable dangers. Yet they chose to step into that uncertainty willingly, their love strong enough to bear the fear of loss. Many of these brides would wait long months with only letters, sometimes sparse, sometimes filled with tender words to remind them that their husbands were still alive. Every knock at the door carried with it the possibility of devastating news, and yet they held on, their courage no less than that of the men they loved. Within the force, the existence of so many marriages became an unspoken truth. Though the rules forbade such commitments, the bonds they created could not be ignored. Soldiers fought not only for their comrades, but also for the wives they had left behind. Some carried photographs tucked into helmets or letters folded tightly in pockets, tokens of love that gave strength when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. In the mud and chaos of battle, the thought of home, of a waiting bride, became a source of resilience, a reminder of the life they longed to return to. When the force entered combat, the presence of war brides echoed quietly in the background of their story. At Monti della Defensa, as they climbed through rain and fog to seize positions others deemed impossible, some carried the knowledge that a wife was waiting for their safe return. At Anzio, during the endless nights of raids, men wrote hurried notes during rare pauses, letters that might take weeks to reach their destination, each word a lifeline stretched across the chasm of war. The casualty rate was staggering, and every wound, every loss, carried with it the shadow of heartbreak far away. The war brides became silent members of the force history, bearing their own trials in the absence of their husbands. The resilience of these women mirrored the resilience of the soldiers themselves. While the men endured physical hardship and relentless combat, the brides endured a different kind of battlefield loneliness, uncertainty, and the gnawing fear that each day might bring the end of a shared dream. Yet their strength was no less vital. The letters they sent, filled with love and encouragement, lifted spirits and reminded the soldiers that beyond the violence lay something worth surviving for. Their role was invisible to the war's official records, but without them, the spirit of the force would have been poorer, their determination weakened. As the war drew on, stories of love and loss multiplied. Some soldiers never returned, leaving behind widows who had scarcely begun their lives as wives. Others came home scarred but alive, reunited with brides who had kept faith through the darkest years. The marriages born in those hurried days of training proved, in many cases, to endure long after the war ended. Their foundations built not on ideal circumstances, but on the unshakable decision to love in spite of fear. These couples built families, carried memories of sacrifice, and reminded future generations that even in times of despair, life insists on love. The tale of the war brides is inseparable from the story of the 1st Special Service Force. Just as the soldiers forged unity that transcended borders, these marriages forged bonds that transcended fear. They are a reminder that the history of war is not written only in strategies and battles, but in the quiet, human moments of connection that bloom even in the harshest of times. General Robert Frederick may have led his men with courage, and the force may have earned its reputation through fearlessness in battle. But alongside those feats were the wives who kept the flame of hope alive, waiting across oceans and continents for men who risked everything. In the end, the story of the war brides is a story of courage equal to that of the battlefield. It is a story of choosing love when tomorrow was never promised, of building families from the fragile threads of hope, and of enduring separation with strength and faith. Their presence lingers in the legacy of the force, a reminder that the victories achieved in Europe were not won by soldiers alone, but were carried too by the unseen strength of those who loved them. In their devotion lies another kind of heroism, one that deserves to be remembered alongside the battles, the sacrifices, and the legends of the Black Devils. Decades after the thunder of artillery had faded and the battle cries had been replaced by silence, the veterans of the 1st Special Service Force and their families returned to the places where their lives had been forever changed. Time had weathered their bodies, slowed their steps, and lined their faces. Yet when they stood once again at the foot of Monti della Defensa, the memories surged back with a clarity that defied the years. What had once been a mountain of fire and death now stood quiet, its slopes covered in grass and silence. But for the men who had climbed it under rain, snow, and relentless gunfire, every rock and tree carried a weight that words could scarcely capture. Returning was not merely a gesture of remembrance, it was an act of honoring those who had not come back, and of connecting the legacy of the Black Devils to generations who had never heard the thunder of war, but lived in the peace brought by their sacrifice. The climb itself became a ritual, not unlike the arduous ascent they had once endured under the storm of battle. Though the veterans no longer carried rifles or heavy packs, each step up the mountain carried with it the invisible weight of memory. Sons and daughters walked beside them, often supporting their fathers' or grandfathers' frail frames, listening quietly as stories emerged that had been locked away for decades. For many of the families, these pilgrimages were the first time they heard details of the battles that had shaped their loved ones' lives. The veterans had returned not only to honor their fallen comrades, but to share with their families the truth of what had been endured, ensuring the past would not be forgotten. At the summit, where once the Black Devils had driven entrenched defenders from seemingly impregnable positions, ceremonies of remembrance were held, flags were raised, prayers spoken, and names read aloud, some of them belonging to men who had been young and full of life when they last stood on that ridge. Tears fell freely, not only from the veterans but from their families, who came to understand that the bonds of brotherhood forged in the crucible of war had never been broken by time. Those who survived still carried the memory of the fallen, as though they were standing beside them. And in these moments of remembrance, the force was whole again, reunited across generations. The journeys to Italy and other battlefields became more than commemorations, they became bridges between the past and the present. Grandchildren, who had grown up hearing fragments of stories about painted faces and daring raids, now walked the ground themselves, touching the stones, breathing the air, and seeing with their own eyes the terrain where legends had been born. The presence of new generations was not accidental but intentional. The veterans knew their time was limited, and they wanted to pass on the legacy of courage, unity, and sacrifice before the last voices fell silent. In their stories, told while standing on the ridges where those memories had been forged, history came alive in a way no textbook could capture. These visits were also acts of reconciliation, not just with the past but with themselves. For many veterans, the war had been carried within like an unspoken burden, its horrors locked away in silence for decades. To return, to walk once more the paths of battle, was to confront those ghosts and to share them at last with those who loved them. Families listened, sometimes in shock, sometimes in awe, but always with gratitude, recognizing that the stories were not only about war but about resilience, loyalty, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The silence that had lasted for years was finally broken, and in that breaking, healing began. Monti della Defensa, Anzio, and other sites of battle became sacred ground, not only because of the blood that had been spilled there but because of the living memories that continued to return. Veterans stood with canes and medals, pointing to ridgelines where comrades had fallen, their voices heavy with emotion but steady with pride. The families followed their gaze, seeing in those landscapes not just hills and valleys but the stage of extraordinary acts of courage that had shaped the course of history. For the younger generations, these moments created a sense of connection that no distant story could match. They walked away with more than memories, they carried an inheritance of duty and gratitude that would shape their understanding of the past forever. The commemorations were not about glorifying war, for the men who had lived it knew better than anyone the cost it carried. Instead, they were about honoring sacrifice, about remembering the brothers who had given everything, and about ensuring that the lessons of unity and resilience endured. Just as General Robert Frederick had once stood at the front, embodying the spirit of shared struggle, these gatherings reminded everyone present that leadership, sacrifice, and loyalty were timeless values, not confined to the battlefields of the past. As the veterans aged, each returned to the mountains and beaches carried with it the knowledge that it might be their last. Yet they climbed, they remembered, and they shared, because the legacy of the Black Devils was too important to fade. The children and grandchildren who accompanied them became the keepers of that legacy, carrying forward the stories of painted faces in the night, of men who returned to battle even when wounded, of forbidden marriages that blossomed into enduring families, and of comradeship that transcended borders. In the end, the revisits to Monti della Defensa and other battlefields were more than ceremonies, they were living history. A passing of the torch from those who had lived it to those who would carry it forward. The mountains no longer echoed with gunfire, but with voices of remembrance, with the laughter of families, and with the solemn silence of gratitude. The Black Devils had once carved their reputation in the crucible of war, but decades later, they carved something just as enduring, a legacy of unity, sacrifice, and brotherhood that would never be forgotten. carried now not only in the memories of those who fought but in the hearts of generations yet to come. When the first Special Service Force was finally disbanded in 1944, there was no grand parade to mark their departure, no dramatic ceremony to encapsulate what they had achieved. Instead, the men were quietly reassigned, the flags folded, and the chapter officially closed. Yet their story did not end there, because the essence of the Black Devils could never truly be disbanded. Their unity had crossed borders, binding Canadians and Americans into a single brotherhood. Their sacrifices had freed towns and villages across Europe, leaving behind not just scars of war, but also seeds of gratitude that still bloom in memorials and in the hearts of the people they liberated. Though their time as an official unit lasted only 29 months, their legacy has stretched across decades, carried forward by their families, by historians, and by every grateful voice in Europe that still whispers a simple word: thank you. Even today, in small villages across Italy and France, you will find plaques, gardens, and monuments dedicated to their memory. Some were erected by governments, but many came from ordinary citizens who never forgot the kindness of strangers who came from across the ocean to fight for their freedom. Families of veterans still travel to these places, walking the same cobblestone streets their fathers and grandfathers once marched through, often greeted by locals who continue to treat them as honored guests. This enduring gratitude reminds us that the legacy of the Black Devils is not frozen in the past, it is alive in the relationships, stories, and commemorations that bridge generations and nations. Their story also lives in the personal memories passed down within families. For many children of veterans, the first Special Service Force was not just a military unit, it was the reason their father survived, the reason their family even existed, and the foundation for the values of courage and loyalty that were handed down to them. The war brides who once worried each day about losing their young husbands carried on their own quiet form of bravery, raising families and ensuring that the sacrifices of those years would never be forgotten. Their children and grandchildren now act as torchbearers, preserving the memory of the Black Devils not as distant history, but as family heritage. The force also endures in military history as a trailblazer. Their tactics, their training methods, and their spirit of cooperation between nations paved the way for modern special forces around the world. Today's elite units still draw inspiration from the audacity and resilience of the Black Devils, whose success was measured not just in battles won but in the strength of their unity. The lesson they left behind is clear: when people from different backgrounds come together for a common purpose, extraordinary things become possible. And perhaps most importantly, their legacy lives in us, the listeners, the learners, and the inheritors of their story. Every time we recall their courage, every time we share their history, we ensure that the sacrifices of those young men are not forgotten. They remind us that freedom is not guaranteed, that unity is powerful, and that even in the darkest of times, courage and camaraderie can light the way forward. As we close this journey into the history of the first Special Service Force, let us carry with us the lesson they left behind, that true heroism is not about conquest or glory, but about sacrifice, loyalty, and the willingness to stand together against fear. Their time as a unit ended in 1944, but the spirit of the Black Devils continues to echo across generations, urging us to remember, to honor, and to live with the same resolve and unity they displayed on the battlefields of Europe. Thank you so much for joining me on this story. If you found this history meaningful, if you believe that the memory of these extraordinary men should continue to live on, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who may also want to reflect on their legacy. Your support not only helps this channel grow but also helps keep alive the memory of the Black Devils and the lessons they left behind for all of us. With that, I want to wish you peace, gratitude, and rest. May you carry with you the spirit of unity and courage as you head into tomorrow. And may the memory of those who sacrifice so much remind us of the value of every new day. Thank you once again for watching, and good night.